So maybe I should just say a few words about what the idea here is, that we have, this is the first in the series of these Dozentenabends that we'll have this year, this semester. And it will be both a social and an academic event in some sense. Idea is to start the talk about 1:15, but give people a chance to eat, to mingle, to talk, which is not happening yet, but might happen in the future. And then to have a talk that basically lasts better part of 3/4 of an hour. And then at 8, we'll again sort of open up to the discussion, and then once the questions are exhausted, turn into a more informal form of hanging out. But maybe I'll start then. I've proposed that the theme of home and exile could be a leitmotif that runs through the Dozentenabends of this semester and perhaps this year, partly because I think these are big themes that speak to our current condition and also to eternal problems of the human condition. And one of my aims today in giving this talk to you will just be to talk about the relevance of these themes to my own life and to my own academic work, and maybe inspire you to think more broadly about how these might be relevant to you and to your own endeavors. The choice of theme is also in the spirit of my position. I'm the first appointed visiting professor of the Estonian diaspora, and the key concept of any diaspora, of course, is exile, being thrown out of one's sort of homeland and then thinking about how to remake or redefine one's identity. So, insofar as one of my tasks as this visiting professor is to think about and to help promote connections between the Estonia and foreign Estonians abroad, but people all around the world. So let me begin then. I've titled my sort of presentation to you today, Home and Exile, Tartu's Place in Me and the World. And the general path I want to follow today is one from sort of from personal intimacy to more universal, broad, general claims. Start with my own experience and then culminate with my teaching and my research and the way in which home and exile play an important role there. First section of my presentation, At Home, Tartu's Place in Me, perhaps is the most narrow of these sort of different sections before we get to larger questions of the relationships between selves and others in world history, home and exile in world history, and finally how we might think about Tartu's relevance to world history and its place in the world. But this past August, I was really inspired to spend a lot of time with these themes of home and exile. August was an important date or an important month because it was I celebrated the purchase of my first home here in Tartu, which is in Karlova at the address of Õnne 33, Happiness 33 for those of you who don't speak Estonian, and started thinking about the idea of happiness and home and how these are intimately connected to one another. But in the broader scheme of things, I come from far away. I come from Santa Cruz, California, or in fact the Santa Cruz Mountains, where my address is at 401 Pine Flat Road in the community of Dune. And there's a third home that I want to, that I think is relevant here, or became part of really my thinking in August, and that is the address Gaston Street number 9. Which was the last home my mother and grandmother lived in before they went into exile in 1944. So these three homes are very present for me throughout this August month, and they became all the more present to me insofar as I went to visit Gaston Street number 9 for the very first time. I got to see it from the inside, and some events that erupted in California also made me think about home. The fires in California, they came within about 100 or 200 meters of my parents' home there, or the home I grew up in. And again, I was made to think about the nature and the value of home and the extent to which it is endangered in our world today. The pictures here are of my new home, Unna 33, Happiness 33. And this image of a globe in a nest is one I used for a kind of conference festival I organized to commemorate this moment, to make people think about the extent to which the entire world can be a home, and the extent to which we live in a world that we are trying to make or turn into a home for all of our endeavors. 401 Pine Flat Road, back in Bonnie Dune. This is the view from the front door. It's in the midst of, you can see, a forest, a sequoia or a redwood forest. And the front porch from which that picture was taken is here. It was a big part of my, you can say, my past as a foreign Estonian. We had a famous guest come to visit us in 1986. You might notice him, maybe the most famous Estonian of all, Dorpater, who here is holding my brother, and I am sitting there next to him looking rather unhappy. And behind them is my grandmother, Taimi Lepasaar, and my aunt, Ulle Lepasaar, and my mother was probably taking the picture. Last year, I brought this photograph to Laulasmaa, where the Dorpater Center is. I did a redo of it in the spirit of today. The main thing I want to point out here with these photographs and with this home is to note that I grew up in a place that was quite far away from other people. My conversations were almost exclusively with my mother, of course, in Estonian, but in the midst of a forest. And always sort of thinking about and talking about another home that she had left behind, another home where things were different. So Estonia was always part of the picture, and Tartu was part of the picture from the very beginning. And as I suggested, in August, all of this was put in great jeopardy with the Great Bonnie Dune fire. It's almost a fire of biblical proportions, or it seemed that way to me. The pictures I saw, pictures of the burning bush here, or a tree on fire in Bonnie Dune. Many of my friends, childhood friends, had their homes consumed by the conflagration. This map here, you see with all the red, that's where the fire reached, and the home of my parents at 401 Pine Flat Road is there in this kind of peninsula of unburned land amidst all of it. The scale is rather small. It's just a couple hundred meters or to the nearest flames. And when my mother was evacuated, and with my father, they were given basically a half hour to pack their belongings and were forced to think about what it would mean to lose everything that they have built over the course of their lifetimes. It was a strange moment for me, because at that very precise moment when they were running away from this home that was in danger of burning down, I was visiting Gaston Street number 9, the home that my mother was forced to abandon or run away from in 1944. As a 2-year-old child, she doesn't remember very much of it, but her grandmother, of course, does. And I had my first opportunity ever to actually verify some things about this apartment, to see it from the inside. The current owner showed me this room and speculates that this is probably my mother's bedroom for the first 2 years of her life. I spent a lot of time, of course, walking around the house, looking at it from the outside. This is the living room behind which the bedroom is located, with this enormous 3-meter fireplace, which I found quite sort of an interesting structure on its own. But what made this all particularly fascinating and interesting to me was the knowledge that, and I finally got confirmation for this then in August, that this was in fact the apartment of Yuri Lotman, perhaps the most famous scholar of the Soviet period in Tartu, where he lived for the better portion of 2 decades after he arrived from Leningrad in 1950, fleeing the persecution of Jews that was happening there, and settled with his large family in this apartment. This fireplace has an important role in the kind of the lore of the Lotman family too. And as the current inhabitant told me, it's where both she and Lotman hid their secret documents. On top of this, there's a hole at the top of that of the fireplace. You can cover it with plaster, as people who own this department did. And it was a great place to keep documents that were not supposed to be discovered by the KGB. In fact, this apartment was searched in 1969, I believe it was, when the Lotmans were living here, shortly before they moved out. Now, I spent my whole life sort of thinking about the connection, you might say, between these places and our families. I've always known that the Lotmans lived in this building, but it was interesting to get confirmation that they in fact lived in the same apartment. Here's a picture of my mother, basically as a teenager, and then at her wedding, where we see kind of the coming together of two families, my father's family, the American family, and his father, who was a doctor and a professor of medicine here, but together with my mother's family, my mother and my grandmother, Daimi, who was, in fact, sort of, you could say, the hero of the story of leaving Gaston Street number 9 and coming to America. My mother has always told me that she thinks of herself as a displaced person, and that if she were ever to write an autobiography, it would be titled Displaced Person. And that always, on some level, moved me, but it made me think about the extent to which the entire world is full of displaced people. In many ways, the story of the 20th century is the story of the making of displaced people all around. And to conclude just this first part of my talk, I just wanted to read to you a couple paragraphs from the preface to my dissertation, because in many ways, what I've told you so far is what motivated me to take the approach that I did to Tartu, to studying this other part of the world, and to thinking about my family's connection to that of Yuri Lotman. Daimi Lepasaar here grew up in Tartu, though her parents had spent a lot of time in St. Petersburg when there was very little place to find work in the late Tsarist period. But when the Estonian National Republic came to Estonia in 1918, they moved to Tartu. They ended up moving to that apartment of Gaston Street number 9 eventually, not right away. And here's how I make sense of this relationship and its connection to this house. Daimi grew up in Tartu, the new world of the Estonian National Republic, where she studied piano with the leading composer of the day, Heino Eller. When she turned 19, she married a young man from a nearby farm, Ants Lepasaar, a law student at the recently nationalized University of Tartu. They fled the Soviet occupation in 1944. Ants disappeared near Posen in 1945, and Daimi carried the rest of her family, her parents and 2 young daughters, into exile. After nearly 5 years in the DP camps of Germany after the war, the family finally came to the United States of America. The war and its aftermath ended Daimi's hopes of becoming a concert pianist, but she made a new life for herself in this country as a public school music teacher in Providence, Rhode Island. She died on May 12, 2012, a few months after her 90th birthday, a citizen of the United States of America. Daimi never remarried, never lost her strong Estonian accent, never found out what happened to her husband in 1945, and never learned to think of herself as American. Though inflected by it, this work is not Daimi's story. This is the story of the home she left behind. But the house in Tartu, where Daimi and her parents had their apartment at Gaston Street number 9, became the home in the 1950s and 60s of Yuri Lotman, one of the most remarkable scholars of the Soviet Union and the central figure of the Tartu School of Semiotics. He was born on February 28, 1922, in revolutionary Petrograd, less than 180 miles away and 1 month after my grandmother. On the most intimate level, this story arises out of a desire to understand how my grandmother's home became Yuri Lotman's home, how the children and the grandchildren of one of the greatest Russian literary scholars of all time became Estonian citizens, while my aunt, mother, brother, and I all became American citizens, how the historical forces that uprooted one family and sent it looking for a new home gave a new roots and a new home to another. In 1949, the Treaty of Tordesillas launched the age of global European imperialism by dividing the New World between the monarchies of Spain and Portugal with the blessing of Pope Alexander VI. In the 20th century, the United States of America and the Soviet Union returned the favor to Europe with NATO and the Warsaw Pact and the Iron Curtain between them, appealing to the higher authority of scientific and ideological truths disseminated at their respective universities. On the most universal level, the study uses Tartu as a peripheral Baltic observatory in Europe, its states, universities, and languages, ever since the imagined community of Latin Christendom with its Latin-speaking priesthood began to crumble into a babel of national elites, each with its own imagined community, speaking its own tongue. But for me, this is a story that begins with two families in the two most powerful states of the 20th century, strangers to one another's experience, united only by the Estonian language, Tartu University, and the memory of two very different times when Gaston Street number 9 was home. So that's how I basically set up my dissertation and all of my intellectual endeavors ever since, was trying to figure out how the home of one family became the home of another. And what I want to do now, in the second part of this presentation, is just reflect with you a little bit on how these larger problems and these larger themes started to resonate for me, both in my research and in my teaching. One of the very first things I did actually, after I got my PhD, or even before I finished it, because I started teaching at UC Berkeley before I finished, was to teach a course in world history. And inspired by my basically reflections on Yuri Lotman's family and their connection to our family and in the same apartment that was the home of these two different families, I increasingly came to see the world history I was supposed to teach as a problem of figuring out the relationship of self to other. That this is one of those themes that we can find over the course of, well, certainly 10,000 years, if not 100,000 years. It's basically the question we're always asking when we're studying history, on the widest possible sense, is who are the groups, who are the people we identify as members of our own, and who are the people who belong to the strangers, to the others. I had a very influential professor who helped me sort of think through the problem of selves and others in world history by suggesting at one point that world history is really just one of two stories, that there are really only two stories we ever tell about the world. The first one is one of us goes on a journey, and the other story is a stranger comes to town. And basically you can tell and turn any story we talk about into one of these two stories. The self going on a journey or a stranger coming to town. Maybe this is inadequate, maybe this is more limited than the stories that are actually out there. But I found this enormously fruitful and productive for my own thinking about the world and trying to make sense of the enormous diversity that has existed in the world over the course of 10,000 years. One thing that I really noticed about teaching world history, which is so different from teaching my specialty or more limited forms of history, is that we're constantly in pursuit of continuities. Change is much less interesting than continuity. Something that can grasp the changes of the world over the course of 10,000 years is a much harder thing to find than any particular alteration. So the whole emphasis of history gets changed. It's not about change over time. It's about continuity over time. World history, I find. And for me, basically thinking of world history in terms of these two stories, one of us goes on a journey, the story of exile, the story of leaving Estonia, or stranger comes to town, Lotman moves into the apartment at Gaston Street number 9. We basically have two very fascinating dynamics to deal with. We have the problem of estranging what we think we know, turning the familiar into something foreign. And then we have the problem of domesticating the foreign, turning what is foreign into something that we can deal with, that we think is relevant to us, that is worth knowing. And insofar as world history is a story of selves and others, people who don't know each other, who are really foreign to one another's experience, this dynamic and the back and forth seem to be one of the most fascinating ways to think about the last 10,000 years of human history. One thing we're left with in thinking about the big scope of world history is, and the change in continuity in it, is in contemplating the overall trend. Where is humanity heading? And perhaps with this we get to some of the themes that will strike you as more relevant or more immediately, obviously connected to the world in which you live. The big question for me became, are we growing together? Are we growing apart? Of course, and we're growing both at the same time. But this is an important and very sort of interesting question to think about over the greater scheme of things. Whether world history is a story of global integration. Marshall McLuhan in the 1960s coined the term the global village, which perhaps the 1960s were one moment, that, like the 1990s, at the height of our faith or belief that the world really is becoming smaller, that we really are acquiring or making a kind of integration that is meaningful, that is helpful, that out of which everybody can benefit. But we can't ever forget the much older biblical story of the Tower of Babel. And the story maybe of, perhaps the story over the long term is more one of global disintegration, things falling apart. Of course, Things Fall Apart is the title of a very famous African work. And perhaps in this particular moment, in the age of the coronavirus, in the age of a radical populism all over around the world, in the age of an internet that is not in fact teaching us to speak to one another, but is creating thought bubbles that seem to isolate us ever more from one another, the story of global disintegration has acquired a kind of resonance that it didn't have 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago. But one useful way, I think, of thinking about the big scope of world history is in terms of the tension between these two narratives and the hope that we have that somehow we can bring people together, and the fear that in bringing them together we're actually sowing the seeds for a deeper and more significant disintegration. To narrow our scope even more, and of course one thing I love about teaching world history is that I'm constantly forced to tackle impossible problems. Tell the whole story of the second half of the 20th century in 3 lectures, for example. Imagine what you would do if you were posed with that problem. And the first impulse is to say, one can't, it's too complicated, it moves in too many directions. But I also found this enormously liberating, because you can't pay attention to detail in the way that you do in the context of most of your particular studies and most of our particular academic disciplines. And I found one of the most fruitful ways of looking at or telling the story of the world since 1945 was in terms of 3 narratives. 3 stories that seem really to resonate with this problem of global integration and global disintegration, but actually take it to a more specific place. I like to think of these, or call these narratives, the narrative of the world as one, the world as two, or the world as many. Now, the narrative of the world as one is the narrative of globalization, and this is, of course, what I think gets emphasized most in the histories of the latter half of the 20th century. How the economic, political, and cultural, social, even ecological basis was set for thinking of the world as a global community, as a global village, as Marshall McLuhan put it. How people became more interconnected. The internet just seems to be part of that larger story. We could talk about the specifics of the way in which this is very true. I think all these narratives are in some level true. I'm not interested in how they're false, but how they are all true in some level. And that's the other thing I find so interesting about doing world history. Is you don't have time to talk about things that are false. You have to focus on what's true. And we spend, I think, most of our time as scholars constantly trying to disprove hypotheses, falsify evidence to show what's not true, is that we lose track of why we're doing this in the first place. What the big narratives are that in fact could give meaning to our lives. Not deconstructing those narratives to show what's wrong with them, but to find the narratives that could, in fact, we might want to believe in, we might want other people to believe in. I find the academic position and the academic sensibility is a very negative one usually. It's about showing what's wrong, what doesn't work, and then criticizing the speaker for having missed the point, or for not having made the right point. But world history, I found, liberated me from this a little bit too, and forcing me to create narratives, not merely deconstruct them. So if one great narrative is the narrative of globalization, which is a very useful and helpful narrative for talking about where we are, the story of the world as two is really the lingering story of the Cold War. The Cold War, you might say, is over. But I think the sensibilities of the Cold War are still with us. In the War on Terror, for example. And the vision that the world can best be understood in a Manichaean sense, divided into good and evil, what we want and what we don't want, sort of the opposition of selves and others, perhaps. And the rather simplistic way of doing that. And this is, an important narrative too, because I think so much of the way we think about the world derives from the era of the Cold War, and certainly this kind of a narrative of selves and others as good and evil, the one and the two. But there's a third narrative, which I would perhaps argue, and I've come to see as the most important one here. I think globalization is important, Cold War is important, but the story of the world as many, or disintegrating into many different parts. And maybe in our historical moment, it's easiest to see the relevance now, when the world really does seem to be disintegrating in so many ways. And this is the story of decolonization, the dismantling of empires, the creation of nation states out of them. It's important and worth remembering that the world in 1900 was a world of less than 50 polities around the world. In the year 2000, there are nearly, or now close, 200 different polities. In that sense, at least, the world has disintegrated into more political units than existed at the beginning of the 20th century. And decolonization, as the story of giving everybody a home, of taking apart old, illegitimate forms of power and authority, and creating new homes, which are in some sense old homes, is really, I think, the most fascinating and powerful narrative that we have today. Although it gets, I think, lost in the narrative of the Cold War and the narrative of globalization, which we tend to focus on more. The 20th century, I sort of came to see as I kept on giving these 3 lectures over and over again, I kept on being fascinated with how much more I thought I needed to be said about decolonization and how overemphasized I thought globalization and the Cold War was. But the 20th century is really also the century of national self-determination. This is a concept that comes into its own after World War I, and in many ways you could say one of the great turning points in global history is the move after 1919 from a world that has been based on empires for almost 3,000, if not 4,000 years, to a world that has declared empires a problem. That's what's sort of fascinating. Empires become evil empires. They become, well, of course, they still exist. They don't disappear. But somehow it becomes embarrassing to be an empire after World War I. Not immediately. Everybody can point to exceptions, the Third Reich, if you want. But in the long term, the Soviet Union and the United States are fascinating as 2 empires that both declare that they're not, and accuse the other one of being empires, even as they kind of do precisely what empires have been doing all along. In this sense, rhetorically, on the level of discourse at least, decolonization, the breaking up of the world into more meaningful political units, and enabling nations to determine themselves, I think, is the most powerful and the most important narrative of modernity. And part of what I was trying to do with this one long slide for you so far is kind of justify that position. Because if I had started out just by saying national self-determination is the great story of the modern world, nobody would have believed me or wanted to come along with me. But maybe now, at least I kind of have earned a place for this argument. And one reason why I'm focusing on this so much, and only one more point on this slide that I want to make, is that one of the fascinating things about the age of national self-determination since World War I is that the moment that nations get made, they get divided. And the story of nation states and of national identities in the 20th century is the story also of divided nations. If you think about it, there are plenty of places that can remind us of this. We have North Korea and South Korea. We have, well, we had for a long time, West Berlin and East Berlin, East Germany and West Germany. We had China and Taiwan, 2 versions of the true China. We have, of course, in a more local sense, in a more local example, we have home Estonia and foreign Estonia. We have the experience of those who stayed here and the experience of those who went away, but continue to think of themselves as connected to the home country. The larger point I'm trying to make to you right here is that I think almost every nation gets divided in its own way in the 20th century, even as nations are empowered as the ultimate, and if not only, unit of political legitimacy in the modern world. And that as nations get divided, and national memories get divided, it seemed the drama of what I talked to you about in the first part of this talk, about my mother running away from an old home and finding a new one, starts to have a somewhat larger and more universal resonance. The third part of this talk also remains on the level of world history, but takes us a little bit beyond the problem of selves and others that I introduced to you in the second part, a little bit beyond maybe the narratives of the modern world that I wanted to emphasize with you, with globalization, with the Cold War, and with the nation state and decolonization. This takes us back to the main theme of today's talk, which is really the idea of home and exile, and how home and exile have an important and interesting place in all of world history in terms of the relationship, certainly between selves and others. I have here on the slide an Estonian painting from 1927. It's been turned into a shopping bag you can get from the Tartu Museum of Art. It's Karin Lutz's painting, the Isle of Happiness, which I found sort of fascinating here in light of this theme, this contemplation of what an Isle of Happiness might be, and the identification, usually, of this Isle of Happiness with home. Home, the more I came to think about selves and others, globalization, Cold War, and decolonization seemed to be the theme that was lurking behind them all. And the question that motivating most tellings of history, whether it is the pursuit of a lost home or the creation of a new one. As an undergraduate, I wrote my thesis on literature and on Herman Melville's Moby Dick, and I kept on coming back to this one statement here. And do you not find a strange analogy to something in yourself? For as this appalling ocean surrounds the verdant land, so in the soul of man there lies one insular Tahiti, full of peace and joy, but encompassed by all the horrors of the half-known life. God keep thee, push not off from that isle, thou canst never return. This ideal that we live or have lived in history, in our own lives, in homes, and that when we abandon those homes, we can never go back to them, we can never recover them, is this wonderful leitmotif of world literature. We find it not only in Herman Melville, but the tension, again, between the home and exile and other parts, find in Rabindranath Tagore's famous novel, The Home in the World, story of colonialism and post-colonial, or the colonial predicament in India, as one again of homes and other parts of the world that are trying to transform or make those homes into something else. I also found, in talking about world history, that it's important to remember that all of Western civilization, in some sense, begins in exile from home. How does the Judeo-Christian tradition begin? With the expulsion from paradise, from the Garden of Eden, from that insular Tahiti in our soul, or from that home that is sort of the basis of our first memories. And so interesting, I think, too, to think about how the story of the world is in the Judeo-Christian tradition, in the Western civilization more generally, when we think even about Odysseus and the Odyssey and the return home at the end, and the question of whether it's possible to go back home and whether it's even desirable to do so. In many ways, the modern and the postmodern condition, I think, are the condition of the 20th century that ask what is it that we want to achieve in this life of ours? Is it to create, is it a world, is it a return to an old and lost home, which is in many ways the national story, the story of decolonization that gives it its legitimacy, returning to an old or lost home? Or is it the making of a world without home, a world of permanent and perpetual exiles, where home is not necessary, perhaps not even possible? The predicament of, you could say, home Estonia and foreign Estonia is caught in the crosshairs, you could say, of this problem, of the question of whether it's possible to return home, whether it's even desirable to do so, whether the world would be made better if we imagined return home as the object of what we're trying to accomplish through all of our politics, through all of our geopolitics, through all of our remaking of the world order. Are we trying to create homes for everybody? Are we trying to help people return home? Or is that undertaking in itself problematic and maybe dangerous? What is the story of decolonization? Returning of homelands to people who have been expelled from them. But in the process, all kinds of new problems get made. This is the story, of course, of every nation state. It's the story of Israel. It's the story of Estonians coming back, trying to claim property that their previous ancestors held, and that is now in the hands of somebody else. This kind of dynamic, this problem of trying to return home, because you're always returning to somebody else's land, trying to claim somebody's land that in the meantime has gone elsewhere. The image of the return home is often presented in very kind of optimistic ways. But I was fascinated and excited to find Ilya Repin's painting of 1884, Neždali, about, well, a painting you could say of a man who has tried to return home. But just take a moment to look at all the facial expressions here. A man who has been thought to be lost, who's probably coming back from his Siberian exile. He's dirty. He's trying to reclaim, we don't know exactly what the story is, perhaps his former family. And everybody's facial expression is different. The little girl is scared. The little boy seems excited. The woman here, perhaps his mother, perhaps his wife, was certainly not expecting this return. And the maid who opened the door is traumatized, it seems, by this experiment, with eyes as wide as plates. The story of the return home is in many ways the story of this painting. I think both in a literal sense, and it's certainly the kind of what my family, I think, experienced when we tried to come home, some ways, to Estonia. But I think what we see in the world at large, when the narrative of decolonization becomes dominant or strong, and we see the world, the purpose of our geopolitics as recreating old homes and helping people to return to those old homes. In the final part of this, of my remarks to you today, I want to, in some sense, come full circle, return to Tartu, though hopefully informed by what I've talked about so far. I started out at home talking to you about Tartu's place in me, and I want to finish in exile, talking to you about Tartu's place in the world. I wrote my dissertation about Tartu University in many ways. I wrote it from a perspective of someone abroad, someone outside. And Tartu became for me a wonderful geopolitical observatory upon a lot of these large questions about the world. Partly because it was itself in exile in some sense. It seemed to offer a view from the periphery. It had always been in the peripheries of the states that claimed it as its own. It's not even in the capital city of Estonia. In that sense, it's in the Estonian periphery, but it's certainly in the Swedish periphery, in the Russian periphery, and in the periphery of the Soviet Union. But I needed a kind of a way of thinking about Tartu as a town, Tartu as a university, as a place that could, as a way to tell the story of what had happened here in the academic and cultural life of the last 400 years. And without getting bogged down in the national story, or the story that is just about Tartu as a national university, as a home for Estonians. Because it is that too, but it is that in dialogue with something much larger. And ultimately, the story I came up with was Tartu as kind of a place for the encounter of strangers, a place that is itself, in some sense, in exile, but a place that is perhaps most interesting to the world and to world history as a place of encounter between Estonians and others over the course of the broad sweep of the last 400 years. The image that I kept on returning to, that I've used in many other talks and presentations, is this image. I'll start with this image. The famous School of Athens is painted by Raphael in 1509, representing perhaps the ideal of cultural and intellectual life in the Renaissance, where we see all these Renaissance, or ancient scholars brought to life in the form of the contemporaries of Raphael, Leonardo da Vinci, playing the role of Plato, for example, in this painting. But this painting was reproduced in the Soviet period for Tartu in this painting, which, if you haven't seen it, it's worth going to check out. It's right next door in the main building of the university, right behind or next to the entryway to the rector's office. Universitas Tartuensis by N. Buldros, painted for the 350th anniversary of Tartu as a Swedish institution in the Soviet period. And for me, this painting became the ultimate and perhaps ideal expression of Tartu University as it imagined itself and told its own story in the Soviet period. And perhaps the best expression of what the university has been in any time and place. For what do we see in this painting? An imaginary encounter among strangers. Imaginary conversation set against the backdrop of the observatory that is, perhaps you could say, the symbol that I made the most of. But for example, here in the foreground we have 3 foreigners, 3 strangers, 3 exiles who made Tartu a home. Jan Baudouin de Courtenay, the ambiguously Polish-French father of modern linguistics, one of them. Hachatour Bovian, a father of Armenian national literature who came to work here also in the 1840s. Vladimir Dahl, one of the first great lexicographers of the Russian Empire and the compiler of the most important, if not first, great Russian dictionary. They were all students or professors or simply spent time here in Tartu in the middle of the 19th century. They spoke different languages. They may or may not have had conversations among themselves. We also have a local Estonian here, Johannes Voldemar-Veski, one of the most important you could say, founders of the modern Estonian language, trying to get in on their imaginary conversation here in the foreground. But what I love about this painting is the question that is kind of left to hover and is unanswered in the background. What is the language that they are speaking to each other? They're having a conversation here. And perhaps that is what Tartu's role has been across the centuries. To look for, to try to find, and perhaps never succeeding in this, a common language in which exiles from other places and other times might find a common language in which to talk with each other. My view, a vision of Tartu as a home for exiles, became kind of the animating idea, or one of the animating ideas of my dissertation. And it can be traced all the way back to the Swedish period. Tartu University's very first historian is a German by the name of Friedrich Menius, who arrived in Tartu in 1632, shortly before he took up his post, allegedly running away from one unsuccessful marriage. And then he left Tartu in the arms of another woman, sort of running away again a few years later. He didn't spend very much time here. But he wrote the first history of Tartu University, barely 3 months after the opening or the inauguration of the university. So we can suspect he was not only a historian, he was the eyewitness to the events he describes. He wrote it in this very kind of quaint, sort of old-fashioned German that's not quite Niederdeutsch. It's not the language of the Hanseatic League, but contains some of those old German elements in it. And the very first thing he tells us about Tartu is that Tartu is the story, or the story of the university is a story of the journey of exiles, of the exiled muses. The muses that have been forced to run away from the ancient world of Greece and have taken up refuge then in Spain and moved through Italy and moved to Holland before they were chased out of there too, and then went through Germany and ended up here in Tartu. The story of the first historian of Tartu University tells the story as a home for exiles, exiles in ideas and exiles also, and I emphasize, among people as well. The larger scope of the dissertation then was about looking at all of these different periods of Tartu's history. When we see Tartu itself as a university in the periphery of all these different states, constantly changing its allegiance, never quite at the center, always playing this role as an element that's supposed to build up, you could say, the official language and the official authority of the state that it's in, but always ends up doing kind of the opposite, questioning or providing a grounds for the questioning of the authorities that are in power. In the Swedish Imperial University, it plays this role kind of as the Latin-speaking go-between the Swedish and the German elites, ultimately enabling the expression of opinions and points of view that were not really sponsored by any of the elites there, but nonetheless found a ground for expression. In the Russian Imperial University, it was the Russian Imperial University under the Russian Empire from 1802 to 1917, it was the only German-speaking university in the realm. And again became a source of of disputed ideas and controversial views that were not particularly loved by the Tsar or by his henchmen. Even in the Estonian National Republic, it came to stand for a Tartu perspective on things that was in conflict with Tallinn, and that opposed the politics of Päts and the nationalist politics of the capital city. And this briefly was a Nazi university for 2 years during the Second World War. And here too, we saw in an interesting way the opportunity to pursue agendas that were totally kind of irrelevant to the interests of Hitler or the Nazi regime. It actually did a lot of work on Finno-Ugric studies in this period, since Estonians didn't really care all that much about Jewish studies or about investigating racial questions with regards to Judaism. But they were very interested in racial questions with regard to other populations, and that's what the work of the Nazi university was. Finally, as a Soviet university, the university also became an important, you could say, home for exiles, as it became the site of many foreign, provided a haven for many foreign scholars who were kicked out of their home universities or were never able to find a job at those home universities, and became a source of not exactly, I would not say dissident thought, but simply ideas that had fallen out of favor in Moscow and Leningrad. The most famous scholar, and perhaps the hero of my dissertation, with whom I would like to slowly now draw to a conclusion, was Yuri Lotman, the famous semiotician and scholar of Russian literature, who proclaimed at one point late in his career that any minimally adequate representation of reality requires at least 2 languages. And I include this idea here because it seems like such an ideal expression of what the university was doing in all of its incarnations through the ages. As a Latin, as a Russian Imperial University, as an Estonian university, as a Nazi university, as a Soviet university, and perhaps I wish it would be doing it even more right now, although, and that is reminding scholars everywhere that the language of those in power and those who have control of the world is not the only language. And that in order to say anything meaningful about the world, you need another language. A language that sees the world differently, that says something differently, that contradicts, perhaps, the positions of those in authority. Ultimately, the exiles that have come to Tartu through the ages have, I would say, encountered the locals in a number of different ways. And I would just list here 3 of them. Tartu has been, academically and as a city as well, a battleground in which different ideas have sort of fought for predominance, and also different populations have tried to rise above others. But at the same time, it's been a refuge. And this is something I want to really emphasize with regard to Tartu University, in that it's been a place where expelled populations and individuals have found a home in exile, to use kind of the leitmotif maybe of this talk. Maura Budberg was an exile, a refugee from communist Russia, she was the daughter of a Ukrainian count, and moved to Estonia in the national period after World War I and made a home for herself here and found a kind of refuge. Lazar Kukovic was a professor of Jewish studies at the University of Leipzig, I believe it was, until Hitler came to power. And then a chair was created at Tartu University from 1930 to really 39 for Jewish studies. And it's estimated that Tartu University may have been the last place in the world where Jewish studies was taught in the German language before World War II. And Lazar Kukovic was the professor who occupied that chair. Most famously, Yuri Lotman came to Tartu in 1950, also seeking a refuge, you could say, from the anti-cosmopolitan, anti-Semitic campaign of Stalinist Russia, because none of the other places that he applied for work accepted him. Now the point here is simply that one of Tartu's part of its enduring importance through the ages is in providing a refuge to all kinds of different exiles. And that perhaps I'll conclude on this note, simply reminding you of the larger point that I was making sort of from the beginning, that we live in a world where we are very preoccupied with the problem in question of home, how to create home, how to return home, and that in many ways world history can be thought of or imagined as a story of exile from homes, and then the question of what to do in that condition of exile, whether to return to an old home or to make a new one. And we're left with the question, I think, that is central to our modern world, is do we need new homes? Or are we better off in a world without homes? And I want to remind you of my conclusion here too, is that Tartu University became for me a way of sort of studying this relationship between home and exile, and thinking of Tartu University as a place that provided a home to exiles. Juri Lotman perhaps was the hero of my dissertation, not merely because he was the most famous scholar here of the Soviet period, but also because it seemed he was the most successful at playing some of these ideas of home and exile against one another. The other kind of candidate for maybe the most famous or most significant or important professor of the Soviet period was a homegrown Estonian, Paul Lariste, who came in second in a national survey of 1999 to determine the most important scholar of the 20th century. Juri Lotman came in first. But one of the things that Juri Lotman, I think, managed to do that might be, has inspired me at least, is to turn this place of exile into a home. And to remind us of why selves and others need each other, and how home and exile are always in our modern world intimately related. In one of his last public appearances and the lectures that he gave on Estonian television, he talked about the relation of self and other in the following terms. To make what is ours meaningful, that is to say new, we must place it in the position of the other, and then we encounter it again, and it becomes ours again. In other words, to really appreciate what we have, to enjoy our homes, we need others in the world, and we need perhaps the position also of exile through which to think through why it is that our homes are important and meaningful to ourselves. I would end there. Thank you.